Welcome to Fragile Bonds, to the powerful stories of family, love, loss, and the choices that shape our lives. Now let's begin today's story.
My name is Laura. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer. My husband David manages an architectural firm. He's kind and honest, and we've been married for 8 years. And we have our 6-year-old daughter, Sophie. She's a bright and innocent girl who wakes me up with a smile every morning. Our life was very happy. David would leave for work early in the morning and come home in the evening. During the day, I'd work on design projects in my home office while taking care of Sophie. We'd have dinner together as a family of 3, and Sophie would tell us about her day at school. On weekends, we'd go to the neighborhood park or catch a movie. It was an ordinary daily life, but to me, it was precious. Our family had one more important person. David's mother, Margaret. She was someone everyone in the area knew. People treated Margaret like a saint, looking at her with respect. And for good reason. Margaret had been supporting orphans and children in need for 30 years. She had a reputation for taking in many foster children and raising them with love. She'd been featured in the local newspaper many times and had even been honored as a philanthropist. I myself thought Margaret was a wonderful mother-in-law. She'd welcomed us warmly and doted on Sophie. Once a month she'd visit our home, bringing homemade cookies. David seemed to deeply respect his mother and always spoke words of gratitude about her. But 2 weeks ago, everything changed. Margaret died suddenly at her home. The doctor diagnosed it as a heart attack. David was deeply saddened and took several days off work. It was the first time I'd seen him cry since we'd been married. All I could do was hold him and be there for him. But sometimes there was something strange. A shadow would cross David's face. It looked as if he was carrying something heavy, different from grief. One day, I asked, "Are you okay?" David paused before answering. "Yeah, I was just thinking about Mom." But his eyes looked like they were hiding something. Preparations for the funeral began. Surprisingly, we were told that over 200 people would attend. People who said they'd been helped by Margaret came one after another to pay their respects. Former foster children also got in touch, saying they wanted to attend the funeral. Everyone was grateful to Margaret and spoke of what a wonderful person she'd been. But there was one strange thing. There was someone David was avoiding contact with. One day, the phone rang and David answered it. When he hung up, his face changed color. When I asked who it was, David only said it was someone he couldn't reach anymore. He didn't say anything more. The night before the funeral, David was alone in his study. When I went to check on him, he was opening and closing drawers. He seemed to be looking for something. But he couldn't seem to find it and looked irritated. When I asked what he was looking for, he said it was old photos of his mother. But his expression was dark, and he didn't really look like he was searching for photos. The day of the funeral was clear and calm. But my heart wasn't clear. David's behavior was strange. He barely touched his breakfast and kept checking his watch. As I helped Sophie put on her black dress, I watched my husband's profile. When we arrived at the church, an amazingly large number of people had gathered. It looked like more than 200 people. Everyone had serious expressions, mourning Margaret's death. Flowers were piled like a mountain around the casket, and Margaret's portrait was displayed in the center. Looking at her photo with that gentle smile, I felt tears welling up too. The funeral began. The pastor stood at the podium and began speaking about Margaret. Margaret was God's messenger, the pastor said. How she had saved so many children and given them love. How much she had contributed to the community. The attendees nodded at these words, tears streaming down their faces. In the front row sat former foster children. They wiped their eyes with handkerchiefs while gazing at Margaret's portrait. To them, Margaret must have been a mother. Seeing their grief, I felt once again what a wonderful person Margaret had been. David sat next to me, staring straight ahead. His hand was cold and trembling occasionally. I held his hand. I wanted to tell him it would be okay. But even as David squeezed my hand back, he didn't move his gaze. At that moment, I noticed a man sitting in the back. He alone wasn't crying. He sat expressionless, like a stone statue. He wore a black suit, and his eyes showed no emotion. David seemed to notice him too. I felt my husband's body stiffen for a moment. His face changed color and sweat appeared on his forehead. I asked quietly what was wrong, but David just shook his head. The pastor's sermon continued. The attendees listened quietly. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered. Everything proceeded solemnly and peacefully. But then it happened suddenly. The man in the back stood up abruptly. A murmur went through the church. Everyone turned to look at him. Without saying a word, he just started walking down the aisle. Only his footsteps echoed through the church. And he walked toward the exit. No one called out to him. They just watched him leave with confused expressions. David tried to stand up. I grabbed his arm. I asked what he was going to do, but David didn't answer. His hand was shaking violently. In the end, David sat back down. But for the rest of the funeral, he didn't speak a word. He just clenched his hands and looked down. The funeral ended and we moved to the cemetery. The casket was slowly lowered into the grave. Attendees came forward one by one to offer flowers. Sophie and I also placed white roses. Sophie said in a small voice, "Goodbye, Grandma." But David seemed restless. He kept checking his watch and looking around nervously. It was as if he was on guard for something. When the burial was finished, the attendees comforted each other and shared memories of Margaret. Former foster children tried to speak to David. But David told me we should leave soon. When I asked if he wasn't going to talk with everyone, David said he'd call later. But there was urgency in his voice. He hurriedly picked up Sophie and started walking toward the car. I rushed after him. "David, wait," I called out, but he didn't look back. Sophie was looking at me with a confused expression too. When we got in the car, David immediately started the engine. The car started moving before I could even fasten my seatbelt. "David, that's dangerous," I said. But he continued driving in silence. The car was completely silent. Sophie sat in the back seat, looking out the window. I stared at my husband's profile. His jaw was tightly clenched and his eyes were fixed straight on the road. I gathered my courage and asked. "That man earlier, who was he?" "The one who left the church." David was silent for a while. Then he answered in a small voice. "A child my mother used to care for." "Then why didn't you say hello to him?" I continued. "He came to see your mother too, didn't he?" David didn't answer. He just pressed down on the accelerator. The car sped up. "David, you're going too fast," I said, but he didn't seem to hear me. Soon our house came into view. David slammed on the brakes and stopped the car in the driveway. He quickly got out of the car and picked up Sophie. Then he started running toward the front door. "David, what's wrong?" I shouted. But he didn't answer. I also quickly got out of the car and followed him. David opened the front door. He went inside and stood still for a few seconds. Then, when he turned around, his face was deathly pale. "Laura, Sophie, get in here now," he shouted. When I rushed into the entrance, David grabbed my arm. Still holding Sophie in one arm, he pulled me with his other hand. "What's happening?" I couldn't speak. In David's eyes was a fear I'd never seen before. He dragged us into the hallway and opened the closet door. "Get in," he said. "What? What are you saying?" I asked. But David didn't answer. He pushed Sophie and me into the closet. Then he got in himself and closed the door. The closet was dark and cramped. Coats and jackets touched our faces. Sophie let out a small cry. "Daddy, I'm scared," my daughter said. Her voice was trembling. I also pressed David. "David, what's wrong? Explain. What's happening?" David grabbed my shoulders and brought his face close. His breathing was rough. Then he said in a trembling voice, "Be quiet. Don't make a sound." There was a pleading tone in those words. I was speechless. Sophie clung to me, frightened. At that moment, I heard a sound. The sound of the back door opening. Someone had entered the house. My heart started pounding violently. David put his index finger to his lips, signaling us to be quiet. Sophie buried her face in my chest, trembling. Footsteps could be heard. Slow, heavy footsteps. The person seemed to be walking around the house. There was a sound from the kitchen. The sound of a drawer opening. The sound of something falling on the floor. I cautiously peeked outside through the crack in the closet door. Down the hallway, in the living room, I could see a man's figure. A tall man. He wore a black suit. I caught my breath. It was that man. The expressionless man who had left early from the funeral. He seemed to be looking for something. He was taking books from the bookshelf, flipping through them. Then putting them back on the shelf. Next he was checking the display shelf. He picked up a photo frame and stared at it. "Where is it?" he muttered. "Where is it?" His voice was low but urgent. It sounded both angry and desperate. David closed his eyes and stayed still. Sweat appeared on his forehead. And he gently covered Sophie's mouth with one hand. So Sophie wouldn't make a sound. My body shook with fear. What's happening? Why has this man broken into our house? Why is David so terrified? The man's footsteps came closer. He was walking down the hallway. Toward the closet where we were. I held my breath. My arms holding Sophie tightened. David also stiffened his body. The footsteps stopped. The man seemed to have stopped in the middle of the hallway. Then he started walking again. This time toward the bedroom. I heard the sound of a door opening. The man entering the bedroom. The sound of things moving. The sound of opening a closet. The sound of checking under the bed. I looked at David's face. He opened his eyes and looked back at me. There was an apologetic look in his eyes. And it seemed like he wanted to tell me something. The man came out into the hallway again. This time he seemed to be heading toward the study. The footsteps moved away. David brought his face close to mine. Then he whispered in a voice so small it could barely be heard. "Laura, listen to what I'm about to tell you." I nodded. David began speaking slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "That man is named Nathan. He's a foster child my mother took in long ago." "I know that," I answered in a low voice. "But why is he here?" David closed his eyes. Then he took a deep breath. The words he spoke next would overturn my world from the ground up. "My mother abused Nathan." "What?" I almost spoke out loud. David hastily covered my mouth with his hand. Sophie looked up at us anxiously. David continued. My mother wasn't a saint. She was a monster. Not just Nathan. There were many others. My mother abused them. She beat them, starved them, broke them down mentally. I couldn't believe it. Margaret. My kind mother-in-law. The respected philanthropist in the community. Tears were streaming from David's eyes. I knew. Since I was a child, I knew all along. But I couldn't do anything. I was afraid of my mother. And even after I became an adult, I suffered from guilt but did nothing. I turned a blind eye. I was speechless. My mind went blank. David knew. He'd known all along and stayed silent. At that moment, footsteps approached. Nathan had come out of the study. He was walking down the hallway again. And he stopped in front of the closet where we were. I stopped breathing. The sound of my heartbeat echoed in my ears. David and Sophie didn't move either. After a moment of silence, Nathan moved. His hand touched the doorknob. Slowly, the closet door began to open. Light streamed in. There Nathan stood. He was looking down at the three of us. But his expression wasn't aggressive. It was an exhausted, deeply wounded expression. Like someone who had finished a long journey. David, so you were here, Nathan said. There was no anger in his voice. Just deep fatigue. David stood up. He stood in front of Sophie and me, facing Nathan. Nathan, please. Don't hurt my family, David said. His voice was trembling. Nathan shook his head. Don't worry. I didn't come to hurt your family. Still holding Sophie, I looked up at Nathan. His eyes were deeply sunken. Long years of suffering were etched there. Nathan slowly began to speak. I just wanted evidence. That woman's diary, or letters, some kind of evidence. David asked. For what? Nathan smiled sadly. Even though that woman is dead, the world will remember her as a saint. I couldn't allow that. I wanted to reveal the truth. I wanted someone to know about the suffering we went through. Those words were filled with deep pain. I stood up. Still holding Sophie, I stood next to David. And I said to Nathan, I'll help you. David looked at me in surprise. Laura, he said. I looked back at my husband. What your mother did is unforgivable. Let's reveal the truth. Nathan looked at me. For the first time, a light of hope appeared in his eyes. And tears began to flow. Thank you, he said. His voice was trembling. David also nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'll help too. I'll reveal my mother's sins. That's the only way I can make amends. Sophie looked up at the three adults from my arms. She probably didn't understand yet what was happening. But one day she would understand. And she would know we did the right thing. We came out of the closet and moved to the living room. Sophie anxiously held my hand. Nathan sat down on the sofa and covered his face with both hands. David stood by the window, looking outside. I took Sophie upstairs to the children's room. I told her to draw pictures and gave her crayons and drawing paper. Sophie looked up at me with anxious eyes. Mommy, are you okay? She asked. I'm okay. Mommy will be right downstairs, I answered and stroked her head. When I returned to the living room, Nathan had lifted his face. His eyes were red and swollen. David was still standing by the window, but his shoulders were shaking. I sat across from Nathan. And I said quietly, Please tell me. What happened? Tell me everything. Nathan took a deep breath. Then he slowly began to speak. I was taken in by Margaret when I was 10. My parents had died in a car accident, and I had no relatives. I was in a children's home when Margaret took me in. He paused. Then continued. At first she was kind. She made warm meals for me, gave me a clean room. She let me go to school. I thought I finally had a family. But, Nathan said. But that only lasted the first month. One day, I broke a dish. Then Margaret's face changed. A face twisted with anger. And she slapped me. Not once. Many times. I gasped. Nathan continued speaking matter-of-factly. Then hell began. I was beaten every day. For even small mistakes, I was yelled at and hit. Sometimes I was denied meals. Sometimes I was locked in the basement. David turned around. There was pain on his face. And there was mental abuse too. You're worthless. Your parents died because of you. No one will ever love you. I was told these things constantly. Every day, every day. Nathan's voice began to shake. I tried to run away. But Margaret was a community leader. No one believed me. I talked to a teacher at school, but was told there's no way Mrs. Margaret would do such a thing. I contacted Child Protective Services too, but Margaret cleverly covered things up. When they visited the house, she played the role of a kind mother. I clenched my fists. Anger welled up inside me. How did no one notice? How did no one help? Nathan continued. I endured for 15 years. When I turned 25, I was finally able to leave the house. But the psychological wounds didn't heal. I have nightmares. I can't trust people. I can't hold down a decent job. He looked at me. And I wasn't the only one. There were many others. Margaret took in foster children one after another and abused them. But her public image was perfect. As a philanthropist, as a saint, everyone respected her. David spoke. His voice was hoarse. I knew. Since I was a child, I watched it all. My mother beating the foster children. The sounds of crying and screaming. But I couldn't do anything. Nathan looked at David. You were different. You were her biological son. Margaret was kind to you. You were special. David shook his head. No. I was afraid too. I was afraid that if I went against my mother, I'd suffer the same fate. So I stayed silent. I was a coward. He punched the wall. Even after becoming an adult, I did nothing. I lived away from my mother, but I didn't have the courage to reveal the truth. When my mother died, I felt relieved. But at the same time, I felt crushed by guilt. Nathan said quietly. I didn't come to blame you, David. You were also a victim. You were a child. But I stayed silent even after becoming an adult, David said. I stepped between the two of them. It's not too late now. Let's reveal the truth. Let's make the world know what Margaret did. Nathan nodded. That's why I wanted evidence. Margaret's diary, letters, some kind of physical evidence. Testimony from victims alone might not be believed. Margaret's reputation is so strong. David said. The basement. My mother hid a safe in the basement. I saw it once as a child. There might be something there. The three of us headed to the basement. It was a dim, musty space. When David pressed part of the wall, a hidden door opened. Behind it was a small safe. With trembling hands, David turned the dial on the safe. He failed several times, but finally there was a click and the safe opened. Inside were many old notebooks. David took one out and opened it. Then his face changed color. "This is," he murmured. I also looked over his shoulder. There, written in Margaret's handwriting, the pages were filled with text. It was a diary. With trembling hands, I turned the pages. There, records of abuse were written in detail. Which child was given what punishment? Why they were punished. And horrifyingly, Margaret justified it all. This child was rebellious, so education was necessary. By withholding meals, I taught gratitude. Physical punishment is an expression of love. I felt nauseous. The person who wrote this was called a saint by the world. When we searched further in the safe, we found photographs. Photos of foster children. And on the back were notes labeled punishment records. There was also a photo of Nathan. A photo of him as a child. On the back was written in detail the punishments he'd received. Nathan took the photo and stared at it. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Finally. I can finally prove it. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Yes. Now we can reveal the truth. David took out other notebooks. In them were written the names and contact information of other foster children. Let's contact these people. If we all testify together, no one can deny it. I nodded. That's right. You're not alone. We'll all speak up together. Nathan showed a real smile for the first time. It was a smile filled with relief and hope. Thank you. Thank you so much. We came out of the basement and returned to the living room. There, we discussed what to do next. David would contact the local newspaper. And we'd also reach out to the other victims. A long night was about to dawn. But our fight had only just begun. David contacted the local newspaper the next day. He met with a reporter and showed them Margaret's diary and the evidence photos. At first, the reporter had an expression of disbelief. But as they read the diary and looked at the photos, their face changed color. The article was published a week later. A large headline splashed across the front page: "Philanthropist Margaret was actually an abuser." The community was shocked. Everyone reacted with disbelief. But the evidence was clear. The diary written by Margaret herself. Detailed punishment records. And most importantly, the testimony of the victims. Nathan came forward first. And following him, other victims began to speak out. 5 in total. They courageously spoke about the abuse they'd suffered. They answered media interviews, testified in court, and revealed the truth. Margaret's reputation completely collapsed. Her gravestone was defaced with protest graffiti. The charity organization that had borne her name changed its name. The awards given to her were revoked. The woman who had been called a saint would now be remembered as an abuser. But that wasn't all. With the truth revealed, a path opened for the victims to receive help. Psychological counseling was provided, and support organizations were established. Other abuse victims who hadn't been able to speak out also found the courage to come forward. David used his entire fortune to establish a victim support fund. "I'll atone for my mother's sins," he said. He went around apologizing to Nathan and the other victims one by one. One day, David met alone with Nathan. He bowed deeply and said, "I won't ask you to forgive me. But let me apologize." I stayed silent. That was also a sin. Nathan placed his hand on his shoulder. "David, you're not to blame. You were also a victim. But now you're trying to make amends. That's enough. Thank you. The two shook hands. And for the first time, they exchanged genuine smiles. Several months passed. We moved to a new house. We decided to leave the area near Margaret's house and start a new life in a new place. Sophie started at a new school and quickly made friends. Nathan began visiting our home from time to time. At first he was reserved, but gradually he became more comfortable. Sophie loved him and would hug him every time he came. "Uncle Nathan, please come again," Sophie would say. "Yeah, I'll come again," Nathan would answer gently. One Sunday, the four of us sat around the dining table. We were laughing together while eating pasta that David had made. Nathan told a joke and Sophie giggled. Watching this scene, I said to David, "Family is a strange thing, isn't it?" David nodded. "It's not about blood. It's trust and love. That's what makes a family." Nathan also smiled. "I didn't have a family for a long time. But now I'm here. Together with you all." Sophie said innocently. "Uncle Nathan is family too, right, Mommy?" "Yes, that's right," I answered. We'd found a new form of family. Even without blood ties, caring for each other, supporting each other, loving each other. That's what a real family is, I thought from my heart. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set. Orange light illuminated the room. We continued our meal with smiles. Even with blood ties, an abuser is not family. But without blood ties, people who protect and love each other can become family. That's what we learned. And survivors of abuse have the right to speak up. The right to tell the truth. The right to seek justice. Nathan and the other victims exercised those rights. And they changed the future. You may not be able to choose your family. But you can create a family. A real family bound by trust and love. We were proof of that.